So, Chris, let's talk about Labour. So, how are they pitching themselves going into the election?
Well, this is the kind of card that's been sent out to voters. Scotland needs change, and there we have Anas Sarwar. On the other side there, we've got fix the mess, get the basics right, build a better future. That's the talking points that Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, that's what he wants to be talking about. Unfortunately for him and for Labour in Scotland, what a lot of voters want to talk about is how much they don't like Keir Starmer and how disappointed they are in the performance of the UK government, which obviously won a landslide election victory in 2024, including here in Scotland. You know, that's a important thing to remember is Labour have had, you know, the 2010s were a pretty dismal decade for Labour. They had been supplanted by the SNP at Holyrood. They fell behind the Scottish Conservatives, the sort of mid-2010s. And, you know, they were not looking great shape at all. And then 2024 came round and they won all these Labour MPs across Scotland. And there was a real feeling in certain quarters that it was now only a matter of time before Labour would go on to win at Holyrood. You know, they haven't won a Holyrood election since 2003, which... I mean, I wasn't a working journalist at that point, but I do remember that election. It was a very long time ago. So, you know, this has been hanging over Labour. You know, the fact they've lost multiple Holyrood elections. And then 2024 came, this watershed moment where they finally were back at the races. And Anas Sarwar, you know, he'd always talked about the sort of like two-election strategy, win Westminster 2024 with a very strong Scottish result, use that as a foundation to build upon to go forward to 2026 to the Holyrood election. And obviously it's not panned out like that for various reasons, which I won't go into or repeat myself too much. You know, the UK government has struggled. Some of that hasn't been their fault. You know, they've had to deal with Donald Trump in the White House and his system of tariffs on the economy. They've had to deal more recently with the impact of the Iran war and that causing, you know, certain increases in prices and all this sort of external stuff, but also the domestic stuff. You know, they've not got it quite right, I think it's fair to say. And Scottish Labour has been punished as a result of that now. And Anas Sarwar has been arguing, look, this election, the Holyrood election, Keir Starmer is not on the ballot paper. You're not voting for Keir Starmer. You're voting for me. You're voting for Scottish Labour. You know, we're voting on who controls the Scottish Parliament and, you know, the very extensive powers the Scottish Parliament has. And, you know, that is a reasonable thing to say. I mean, it's not going to be Keir Starmer that's in charge at Holyrood. However, it's not how basic politics works. Labour are a UK-wide party. And if one part of the Labour Party is not doing well in London, then it has an effect on the Labour Party in Edinburgh. It has an effect on the Labour Party in Cardiff. You know, they can't just disassociate themselves entirely as much as maybe they would like to. Because obviously one of the big moments in Scottish politics this year was Anas Sarwar very boldly, and, you know, this, we shouldn't underestimate just how much of a sort of big thing to do this was. Anas Sarwar stood up in Glasgow and said Keir Starmer should resign. So we had a Labour leader in Scotland calling for a Labour leader in London to go. And at the time, because no other big Labour figure in London, like we didn't see a Wes Streeting, we didn't see an Angela Rayner, we didn't see any of them come out to back Anas Sarwar on this. So Anas Sarwar was kind of stood alone. And he got a bit of flack from particularly political commentators in London, were basically saying, what on earth is he doing? Like, why is he calling for a Labour Prime Minister to quit? But, you know, the answer was, it's because Anas Sarwar and Scottish Labour candidates, Scottish Labour activists, they've had to go out knocking on doors during this election campaign. And one of the first things voters have said to them is, what's going on in London? What's going on with Keir Starmer? And they needed something that they could respond with. They needed to be able to say, look, we recognise there's been difficulties. We recognise Keir Starmer's unpopular. For that reason, Anas Sarwar has stood up and said, we need change in London. We need a new Labour leader to come in. So I think that was the right call. However, the question is, have voters given Anas Sarwar any credit for this? And maybe to a limited extent, yes. But looking at the polls, and a political journalist, we go on and on and on about polls, but they are a reality of these campaigns. The polls have not been particularly kind to Labour, and many of them, they have slipped to third behind Reform. In the worst case scenarios, they've slipped behind the Greens, and even at the fourth place. I think that would maybe be the absolute worst case scenario for them. I think they still have a chance of finishing second. They are still at the races in some constituencies, but it's not been an easy campaign for them at all. They've struggled to talk about Scottish Labour policies as opposed to having to defend the UK Labour government. We've obviously seen the continuing fallout from the Peter Mandelson scandal, which has flared up again right in the middle of the Holyrood election campaign. And obviously that's something Anas Sarwar would rather not have had to talk about. It wasn't Anas Sarwar that appointed Peter Mandelson, the ambassador to the US, but it's still, a Labour government in crisis in London that Anas Sarwar's having to talk about when he's on the doorsteps in Glasgow and he's on the doorsteps in Edinburgh. And for those reasons, it's been a really, really challenging campaign for Labour. I mean, because they do have, here's their manifesto here. It's a pretty weighty document running to, 80 odd pages. A lot of quite detailed stuff about what they would do differently with public sector, what they would do differently with the NHS. But the question is, are Scots prepared to give them a hearing on this? And the polls suggest that not enough of them are for them to find a path to power. Labour have been trying to say in this campaign, look, we could, if certain preambulations happen, there's a pathway for us to take power as a minority government. Right now, a few days out from polling day, I think that looks unlikely, to put it mildly. They would need a lot of things to happen to fall into place for them. There would need to be a substantial drop in the SNP support on polling day. A lot of SNP voters not turning out. They would need, I think, Reform's support to be a bit of a mirage, and Reform voters not to turn out. And I don't think all of those things are necessarily going to happen. So they are in a difficult place, Labour. I think, Anas Sarwar, nobody could accuse him of not working hard. No one could accuse him of, ducking a campaign. And Anas Sarwar loves a campaign. He loves getting out activists. He loves speaking to voters. But he just cannot shake off the record of Keir Starmer and the UK government.
Do you think the Keir Starmer impact is ultimately going to cost Labour then, in terms of potentially finishing second in the election? I think right now, I think Labour would bite your arm off to finish second. I think if they could finish second with roughly the same number of MSPs as they won in 2021, they would take that. I mean, they wouldn't admit this so publicly, but I think privately they would gladly take that. They could say we've held the line in the face of an extremely challenging set of circumstances, and they finished third in 2021, so second would actually be an improvement for them. But as I say, there's no guarantee they will finish second. And I think if the worst happens for them, come Friday, when the votes will be counted, and by Saturday, Sunday next week, when the kind of fallout from the election, the backlash for certain parties happens, and Anas Sarwar, I mean, he probably will stand up and say, go, look, I told you that Keir Starmer was not the man for the job. I told you that Keir Starmer was going to cost us in the election. And I think, he'd be right to say that. I mean, obviously, whatever happens for Labour, presuming they don't win power, presuming, they do face a battle to kind of finish second or third,
There will be questions asked of Anas Sarwar as well. There'll be questions asked about, could you not offered a more exciting manifesto commitment? Could you not offered more robust criticism of the SNP? But for now, Scottish Labour do have the advantages of, they have a big war chest. They are quite a well-resourced party compared to others in Scotland. If you look at social media right now, if you're on YouTube or Facebook, there are Scottish Labour campaign ads everywhere. There is a lot of big spending there. Labour getting their message out on the digital sphere. They're also out knocking doors in the key constituencies. They think they're still at the races. So they would argue, look, we can upset the critics, we can upset the opposition parties, we can upset political journalists like me, and by proving them wrong and getting a better result. And the example they give is there was a by-election, a Holyrood by-election in Hamilton and Rutherglen last May, where Labour were not expected to do well at all. Everyone not everyone, but a lot of people assumed the SNP under John Swinney would pick up that seat relatively easily. It didn't happen. Labour won it. And Labour have been pointing to the example there. We've done it at that constituency. We can do that at a larger scale in 2026. And if they could do that, it would be a hell of a surprise. It would be a hell of a shock. But Labour activists will tell you that that's what they're working towards.